The Quranic verses that reject the Hadith, Part 2. In the previous video, the Quranic verses that reject the Hadith, Part 1, we already explained in details about the 4 Quranic verses that reject the Prophet's Hadith. The 4 Quranic verses are Surah Al-An'am, the cattle, verse 38, Surah Al-An'am, the cattle, verse 114, Surah Al-Araf, the heights, verse 185, and finally Surah Yusuf, Joseph, verse 111. If you haven't watched the previous video or part 1 of this series, please refer to YouTube link in the description below. In today's video, we will explain another 4 Quranic verses that reject the Hadith. We will start with intro first.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
In the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful.
وَيَوْمَ نَبْعَثُ فِي كُلِّ أُمَّةٍ شَهِيدًا عَلَيْهِمْ مِنْ أَنْفُسِهِمْ وَجِئْنَا بِكَ شَهِيدًا عَلَى هَؤُلَاءِ وَنَزَّلْنَا عَلَيْكَ الْكِتَابَ تِبْيَانًا لِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ وَهُدًى وَرَحْمَةً وَبُشْرَى لِلْمُسْلِمِينَ.
The 5th Quranic verse that reject the Hadith. Surah An-Nahl, the honeybees, verse 89. This is part 2 about the Quranic verses that reject the Hadith. In part 2, we will continue to include another 4 Quranic verses as another proof to support the argument about the subject. As noted, we will be using 2 translations as a comparison between them. The first translation is from the Clear Quran and been translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, whereas the second translation is from Sahih International. Continue from the previous video in part 1. The 5th Quranic verse that reject the Prophet's Hadith is Surah An-Nahl, the honeybees, verse 89. The verse and the translations are as below. The first translation: Consider, O Prophet, you the day we will call against every faith community a witness of their own. And we will call you to be a witness against these people of your suit. We have revealed to you the book as an explanation of all things, a guide, a mercy, and good news for those who you fully submit. Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. The second translation: And mention the day when we will resurrect among every nation a witness over them from themselves, i.e., their prophet. And we will bring you, O Muhammad, as a witness over these, i.e., your nation. And we have sent down to you the book as clarification for all things, and as guidance, and mercy and good tidings for the Muslims. Translated by Sahih International. In this verse, basically God is mentioning that during the judgment day, every prophet of every community will testify against their own people about their true belief. God already revealed the book, meaning the Quran, which explain everything about the Islamic religion. The Quran would be a guidance, a mercy and good news for those who fully submit, meaning referring to the real Muslims, or also called the submitters. The question is, why do all of these prophets need to testify against their own people? Why do Prophet Muhammad himself need to testify against the Muslims if all the Muslims are the true believers who follow and obey him? The answer to the question above is the book is an explanation of all things, a guide, a mercy, and good news for those who you fully submit. Meaning, only those people that believe that the Quran is already complete and that the Quran alone is sufficient for them. That the Quran alone is the guidance, a mercy and good news to them. These are the fully submitters, the real Muslims, as they submit only to the Quran alone. And they do not submit to other things other than the Quran. So the job of the prophets during the end of time is to testify against their own people. Do these people only submit to the Torah, the Bible, or the Quran alone, which are part of God's revelations to his prophets? Or are these people also submitting to the Talmud and the Hadith, which are not part of God's revelations to his prophets? As we all know, the Talmud and Hadith are not part of God's revelations to his prophets. These facts should be a common knowledge to all. Because the Talmud and Prophet's Hadith are not part of God's revelations, so both of these books or kitabs are just man-made writings. The Talmud were written by the rabbis of the Jews, whereas the Prophet's Hadith were written by the imams of the Muslims. And then, both of these rabbis and the imams packaged both of these books together with the Torah and the Quran, as though both of these books, the Talmud and Prophet's Hadith, also came from God. But only the Torah and Quran came from God, whereas the Talmud and Prophet's Hadith never came from God. So in the end of times, Moses would testify his followers against the Torah. Jesus would testify his followers against the Bible. And Muhammad would testify his followers against the Quran. So only those people who only submit fully either to the Torah, the Bible or the Quran alone, can be called the real Muslims. All other people that also submit to the Talmud and the Prophet's Hadith, which are not part of God's revelations, they are not considered as Muslims or not considered as the fully submitters in the eyes of God. Thus the prophets would testify against them in order to separate the true believers from the false believers. Thus, all of these false believers would later be thrown down into the hellfire, and the true believers would be raised up to the heaven.
تلك آيات الله نتلوها عليك بالحق فبأي حديث بعد الله وآياته يؤمنون.
The sixth Quranic verse that reject the Hadith. Surah Al-Jathiyah, the kneeling down, verse 6. The sixth Quranic verse that support the Quranist viewpoint is Surah Al-Jathiyah, the kneeling down, verse 6. The first translation, these are Allah's revelations which we recite to you, O Prophet, in truth. So what message will they believe in after denying Allah and His revelations? Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the clear Quran. The second translation, these are the verses of Allah which we recite to you in truth. Then in what statement after Allah and His verses will they believe? Translated by Sahih International. Both the word message in the first translation and the word statement in the second translation refer to the word hadith in this Quranic verse. We also have circled it in red, the Arabic word that mentioned the word hadith. If we replace the word message and statement with the word hadith, the translations will be like this. Surah Al-Jathiyah, the kneeling down, verse 6, the first translation. These are Allah's revelations which we recite to you, O Prophet, in truth. So what hadith will they believe in after denying Allah and His revelations? Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the clear Quran. The second translation, these are the verses of Allah which we recite to you in truth. Then in what hadith after Allah and His verses will they believe? Translated by Sahih International. In first translation, it says, these are Allah's revelations, meaning that only God's revelations, or the God's hadiths contain the truth. So what hadith will they believe in after denying Allah and His revelations? Then second translation also meaning the same thing. Then in what hadith after Allah and His verses will they believe? It basically says, these verses, meaning the Quranic verses, is the God's hadith. The real and only hadith in the Islamic religion. It's not the Prophet's hadith. So what other hadith, other than the Quran, that they would believe in? In this verse also, God is challenging those people who believe in another hadith, other than the Quran. Such as believe in the Prophet's hadith, which is outside of the Quran. Because in this verse, it's already mentioned, the Quran is the real and only hadith. There is no such thing as the Prophet's hadith. There is only one hadith that is real Muslims should believe in. And that is the God's hadith, meaning believing in the Quran alone. Thus, the only one true hadith is the Quran, the God's revelations to Muhammad. However, most Muslims still believe in the Prophet's hadith. And they are denying that the Quran is the real and only hadith. Instead, they are replacing the Quran with the Prophet's hadith as the real hadith. In general, the traditional Muslims, the Sunnis and the Shias, they believe in both the Quran and the Prophet's hadith. However, they make a distinction between the Quran and the Prophet's hadith. That both are not the same. However, based on the traditionalist Muslims' belief, they should all believe in both the Quran and the Prophet's hadith. However, this verse totally rejects the traditionalist Muslims' belief system, which believe in both the Quran and the Prophet's hadith. There can only be one true hadith. And that one true hadith is only the Quran. Other so-called hadith, other than the Quran, such as so-called the Prophet's hadith, is not the truth because it never came from God. Only the revelations that came from God, meaning the God's hadith, is the truth. Thus, this Surah Al-Jathiyah verse 6 supports the Quranist viewpoint and doctrine that reject the Prophet's hadith and only believe in the Quran alone, as mentioned by this Quranic verse.
فذرني ومن يكذب بهذا الحديث سنستدرجهم من حيث لا يعلمون.
The seventh Quranic verse that reject the hadith, Surah Al-Qalam, the pen, verse 44. The seventh Quranic verse that support the Quranist doctrine is Surah Al-Qalam, the pen, verse 44. The Quranic verse and its translations are as below. The first translation: So leave to me, O Prophet, those who reject this message. We will gradually draw them to destruction in ways they cannot comprehend. Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. The second translation: So leave me with the matter of whoever denies this statement, meaning the Quran. We will progressively lead them to punishment from where they do not know. Translated by Sahih International. Again, both the word message in the first translation and the word statement in the second translation refer to the word hadith in this Quranic verse. We also highlighted the Quranic word hadith with a red circle so that you can see with your own eyes that the word message or statement is actually referred to the word hadith. Again, if we replace the word message and statement with the word hadith, the real translations should be like this: Surah Al-Qalam, the pen, verse 44, the first translation: So leave to me, O Prophet, those who reject this hadith. We will gradually draw them to destruction in ways they cannot comprehend. Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. Surah Al-Qalam, the pen, verse 44, the second translation: So leave me with the matter of whoever denies this hadith. We will progressively lead them to punishment from where they do not know. Translated by Sahih International. By replacing the word message and the word statement with the word hadith, it's totally changed the meaning of this verse. Now, we begin to understand that the real meaning of this verse is that God is requesting to Muhammad to leave alone those that already reject the Quran as the hadith to him, so that God will slowly punish them. Thus, what this Surah Al-Qalam verse 44 means is that those people that reject the Quranic verses as the only hadith, God will surely punish them very severely. This verse is totally in agreement with the Quranist viewpoint and doctrine, in which they only accept the Quranic verses as the basis of the Islamic laws and reject the Prophet's hadith to be included into the Islamic laws. This is because, based on the traditional Muslims' viewpoint, they reject that the Quran is the only hadith. Instead, they accepted and believed in both the Quran and the Prophet's hadith. Meaning, they believe in two hadiths instead of only one hadith. Whereas, the Quranic verses already mentioned several times that God only accept the Quran as the only hadith. Other than the Quran, it not considers as the hadith. Because only God's revelations, meaning the Quran, can be acceptable as the real and only hadith. Thus, man-made writings such as so-called the Prophet's hadith cannot be accepted as the hadith in the Islamic religion. Because these Prophet's hadiths never came from God. The Prophet's hadiths were actually fabricated writings of the 4th or 5th generation Muslims more than 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad.
ويل يومئذ للمكذبين فبأي حديث بعده يؤمنون.
The 8th Quranic verse that reject the hadith. Surah Al-Mursalat, those sent forth, verse 49 and 50. The 8 Quranic verse that support the Quranist viewpoint and doctrine is Surah Al-Mursalat, those sent forth, verse 49. The Quranic verse and its translations are as below. The first translation: Woe, on that day to the deniers. Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. The second translation: Woe, that day, to the deniers. Translated by Sahih International. Both of the translations above is saying the same exact thing. That God is totally angry of all of these deniers. If you read through all the verses in Surah Al-Mursalat, the same sentence, keep repeating and repeating again. The sentence woe, on that day to the deniers, is repeated for the 10th times in Surah Al-Mursalat. God initially would mention the sentence, woe, on that day to the deniers. And after that, provide the reason of why God is angry at those deniers. So, there is 10 types of people that God is angry at. This verse 49 is the 10th. And the last and the biggest God's wrath. Who is the people that got the last and biggest God's wrath? Continue on the next verse, Surah Al-Mursalat, those sent forth, verse 50. The Quranic verse and its translations are as below. The first translation: So what message after this Qur'an would they believe in? Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. The second translation: Then in what statement after it meaning the Quran will they believe? Translated by Sahih International. From the translations above, the last and biggest God's wrath is towards the people that deny his hadith and replacing his hadith with another hadith. This simply means that, instead of acknowledging that the God's hadith, meaning the Quranic verses, as the only and real hadith, these deniers are trying to replace the God's hadith with another hadith. We all already know who are these deniers are. These deniers can be referred to as the Sunnis and Shias, imams and Islamic scholars. They are trying to deny that the Quran is the hadith, the one and only hadith that is allowable in the Islamic religion. Instead, these imams and Islamic scholars are trying to replace the God's hadith with another man-made hadith. They called this man-made hadith as the Prophet Muhammad's hadith. But in reality, this hadith never come from Prophet Muhammad. Instead, it should be called the imams' hadiths. Because it was the Sunnis and Shias imams that created and compiled all of these hadiths 200 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. And then, they claimed that all these hadiths came from Prophet Muhammad. So that these hadiths could be legalized as part of the Islamic religion and to be acceptable by the Muslim masses. Again, both of the word message and statement in both translations refer to the word hadith, which we circled it in red. In this verse, again God is questioning us. Do you want to believe in another hadith other than the Quran? The true believers, the real Muslims or submitters to God, have already know this. That the only hadith we can accept and believe is the Quran alone. Nothing but the Quran alone. Again, if we replace the word message and statement with the word hadith, the real translations should be like this. Surah Al-Mursalat, those sent forth, verse 50, the first translation: So what hadith after this would they believe in? Translated by Dr. Mustafa Khattab, the Clear Quran. Surah Al-Mursalat, those sent forth, verse 50, the second translation: Then in what hadith after it will they believe? Translated by Sahih International. By replacing the word message and the word statement with the word hadith, the real meaning of this verse is totally changed. Now, the audience can see the difference. The Quranist Muslims believe that the only real hadith is the God's hadith contains in the Quran. Whereas for the false believers, or so-called the munafiqs, that the Quran is not the real hadith. For them, the real hadith is the sayings of Prophet Muhammad that were compiled into books by so-called imams. Thus, for these false believers, they trust and believe in the so-called teachings of the false imams more than their trust and believe in the teachings of Prophet Muhammad. As a real prophet, Muhammad never teach his followers other than the words of God itself. Muhammad only taught his followers what that have been revealed to him from God. Meaning, Muhammad only taught his followers only to follow the God's hadith alone. Muhammad never has taught his followers to follow his own hadith. But these false imams had corrupted the Islamic religion into following the fabricated writings of theirs. The Quranic verses that reject the hadith, Part 2. The conclusion. In this two-part series, the Quranic verses that reject the hadith We already mentioned in total about 8 Quranic verses that reject the Prophet's hadith. Out of the 8 Quranic verses, 5 of them contain the word hadith in them. As mentioned in Surah Al-Araf verse 185, Surah Al-Jathiyah verse 6, Surah Yusuf verse 111 and Surah Al-Qalam verse 44, the only acceptable hadith is only from the Quran. The 8th Quranic verse, Surah Al-Mursalat, those sent forth, verse 50, is the 5th confirmation that enforced that the only acceptable hadith is the Quran. That the Quran is the God's hadith. And only the God's hadith, as a true believer, can believe in. And not believing in another hadith, such as the so-called the Prophet's hadith. As we can all see, the word hadith is mentioned in the Arabic section on each of the 5 verses. However, when it comes to both of the English translations, the word hadith is never mentioned in any of the 5 verses. Instead, the word hadith is replaced with the word message or statement. Even though both the translations are almost correct, for the Quranists, there seems to be a cover-up against the word hadith to be appear in the English translations or any other translations. For the Quranists, why don't the translators directly translate the word hadith as just hadith in the English translations or any other translations? For the Quranists, the Sunnis and the Shia's translators were trying to sugarcoat the real meaning of the word hadith with another meaning that is similar to the word hadith, in order for the Quranic understanding for the masses to be in line with their own doctrine. Thus, instead directly translated the Arabic word of hadith as hadith in the English translations, they replace it with another words. By replacing the direct English translation as the hadith with the words such as the message, the statement, the news or the story, this would totally change the meaning and the understanding of the Quranic verses that contain the word hadith. Every Muslim in the world knows and understands the meaning of the word hadith. You don't need to explain to a Muslim what is the meaning of the word hadith. The same thing to the word Quran. Every Muslims know and understand the meaning of the word Quran. You don't need to translate to a Muslim that the word Quran means the reading. Or explain to a Muslim that the word Quran refer to the holiest book of the Muslims. It is the same thing to the word Allah. You don't need to translate to a Muslim that the word Allah means the God. Or explain to a Muslim that the word Allah refer to the Islamic God. Every Muslims in the whole wide world knows that. It is the same thing as the word hadith. You can directly translate it to hadith in the English translations or any other translations, and every Muslims would know what it means. But why didn't the translators try to translate the word hadith directly in all of the Quranic translations? To answer this question, we will be looking at clues and reasons in the next chapter. Why the traditionalist Muslims translators didn't translate the word hadith directly. So the issue is, why do the traditionalist Muslims translators didn't translate the word hadith directly in all of the Quranic translations? Why did the translators replacing the word hadith with another the word, such as the message, the statement, the news or the story? For the Quranists, by replacing the direct translation of the word hadith by another word, it would totally change the meaning and understanding of these 5 Quranic verses. Because in all of the 5 Quranic verses, the word hadith is referring to the Quran or specifically to the God's hadith, and not referring it to the Prophet's hadith. However, because the traditionalist Muslims want to cover up all of their lies, they don't want the Islamic masses to know that the real hadith is actually referred to the Quran, or specifically refer to the God's hadith. The traditionalist Muslims want the majority of the Muslims into believing that the word hadith only refer to the Prophet's hadith, and never ever that the word hadith is referring to the Quran verses or to refer to it as the God's hadith. Thus, these traditionalist imams and ulama's were trying to cover up and brainwash the Muslim masses into believing that the word hadith can only refer to the Prophet's hadith. And thus, they avoid to mention the word hadith in all of the Quranic translations. That's why, instead of using the word hadith to refer to word hadith as mentioned in Quranic Arabic verses, they are covering it up with the use of the word, such as the message, the statement, the news or even the story. This is because, if the traditionalist translators directly translate the word hadith as just hadith in the English translations or in any other translations, it would totally change the meaning and understanding of the 5 verses immediately. Thus, the people who frequently read the Quran will soon realize that the real hadith is the Quran, that the real hadith is the God's hadith itself, that the only acceptable hadith in the Islamic religion are the God's hadiths, not the Prophet's hadith. And thus, the Muslim public would begin to question the need of additional hadiths such as the Prophet's hadith. If the Quran is already completed, nothing is left out or neglected out of the Quran. And the Quran is already fully explained in details. And God is also warning us on why should we believe in another hadith other than the Quran? Then, the people would finally realize that the Quran alone is sufficient enough for them as the creed of the Islamic religion. Thus, this will go against the creed of the traditionalist Muslims. Whereas, the creed of the traditionalist Muslims, it's compulsory for them to believe in the so-called hadiths of Muhammad, which in reality are just the writings of their false imams. There is no such thing as the Prophet's hadith. All the 5 Quranic verses above already mentioned and confirmed that the real hadith is the God hadith alone mentioned in the Quran. And this is what the traditionalist imams or the ulamacs fear the most. They don't want that the Muslims masses to realize that all these years, for more than 1,000 years, they were being duped and being conned by these so-called imams and ulamacs. They fear that their secrets would be out in the open. Because, if millions of Muslims finally realized this, their trust and belief in these imams and ulamacs would totally be gone. All these imams and ulamacs, so-called speeches, writings and videos, would become totally useless. As the consequences, all of these imams and ulamacs would totally lose all of their followers. By losing all of their followers, they would also be losing all their earnings that they had previously gained from their followers before. And thus, all of those hadith books would also become useless. Not only these imams and ulamacs would be losing a lot, the printing companies and the publishers that print all of these hadith books would also have gone bankrupt immediately. Because now, the only book that you ever need is just the Quran. And all those hadith books would become piles of rubbish or just piles of tissue papers. The points to ponder for the viewers. Thus, this would wrap up the 2-part series about the Quranic verses that reject the hadith. We already mentioned in total about 8 Quranic verses that reject the Prophet's hadiths. That the Quran is already completed. Nothing is left out or neglected from it. The Quran is already fully explained in details. And the real hadith is the God's hadith in the Quran. That the Prophet's hadith is not part of the true Islamic religion. Because the Prophet's hadith is not part of God's revelations to Prophet Muhammad. And only God's revelations contain the truth. Man-made writings by these so-called imams can be fabricated and thus cannot contain the truth. All of these 8 verses that we already mentioned have totally reject the Prophet's hadith. And all the 8 verses further strengthen the Quranist viewpoint and doctrine about not accepting the Prophet's hadith as part of the Islamic religion. And thus, the Quranist Muslims can only accept and believe in the Quran alone as the main and only pillar of the Islamic laws and belief system. So, the points to ponder for the viewers are, what about you? What are you thinking right now? After we already mentioned and explained all the 8 verses in details? Would you still accept, as a true believer, that the Quran alone is sufficient for you? That the Quran is already fully completed without the need of additional sources such as the Prophet's hadith? That nothing is left out or neglected out of the Quran? Thus, we don't need the Prophet's hadith at all in order to complete the real Islamic religion? That the real hadith is the God's hadith mentioned in the Quran? And thus, we don't need any fabricated writing from the false imams in order to complete the religion? Finally, to end this 2-part series, the Quranic verses that reject the hadith, we can only provide you the details and the explanations in this series. But in the end, it's totally up to you. Either to accept the truth or reject the truth. And the truth can only come from God alone.